I think we've all gone through. I know. And at the time, you know where the main U-Haul depot was in Kamloops?
That was like the first place I went to when I was here.
Welcome to Kamloops. But I do want you to welcome Laura and thank her for coming and presenting today. Thank you, Laura.
So thank you all for coming today. Today I'm going to be talking about global change and the impact on plant communities and ecosystem processes. So here are some pictures of my field sites just to give you an idea of what it looks like. It's obviously a lot different than what we see here in Kamloops. But as we all are aware, human-related activities are altering the climate as well as the landscape. And this is through numerous global change drivers, what we call them global change drivers. And these are things like climate change, altered disturbance regimes, novel assemblages, and land use change. And all these global change drivers interact with one another and affect one another, and they can lead to changes in ecosystem processes and function. So my research thus far has focused on kind of these 5 major themes, to some to greater extent than others, but the resistance and resilience of plant communities to these global change drivers, specifically exploring ecosystem functioning through carbon and nitrogen cycles, biodiversity, plant community assembly, and biotic interactions plant to plant, and that has been primarily theoretical work, but I would like to also explore that, which is something that I would like to explore here, for example. To begin with, I'd like to talk about climate change and what is happening with the climate so we can understand why we would study precipitation and plants in the first place. So industrialization has been changing the climate. So as we're burning more and more fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, and this is leading to rising temperatures, global temperatures. But it's not called just global warming, it's called climate change for a reason, and that is because these rising temperatures are also impacting precipitation. So we're seeing changes in precipitation regimes and patterns. So again, I guess I didn't really mention this before, but I primarily looked at precipitation changes when I was looking at climate change and how it would impact plants and ecosystem processes. So how and why are precipitation patterns changing because of increasing temperatures? And there's a few reasons for this. Much of it has to do with basic thermodynamic principles. So warmer air has a greater capacity to hold water than cooler air. And warmer air also leads to more evaporation. So if you imagine that the air can hold on to more moisture, then that would mean that it's going to fall down, and we're going to see more precipitation as a globe. But that's not necessarily what we see in everyday life. So this is why we're seeing increases in total global precipitation, but it doesn't explain some of the other changes that we're seeing because they're not quite that simple. And when we talk about precipitation, we have to talk about weather. So weather is what we can actually see on a week-to-week, day-to-day basis. And this is created by atmospheric circulation patterns, particularly the jet stream, which is a fast river of moving air that separates the polar north from the colder air in the polar region to the warmer air in the south. And a stable jet stream looks like this, which is pretty much never looks like this, right? It's going to have some oscillation to it. So these oscillations are what create weather, and these are referred to as Rossby waves. So if we look at an example of what we might see on a weather forecast, you'll see that these Rossby waves essentially create differences in where regions that will experience nice weather versus what we would consider bad weather. And what's happened with these Rossby waves is they're slowing down and they're weakening. And to demonstrate this and why this is important is I'll show you this little image of Rossby waves around the globe so you can kind of see what's happening. So to begin with, you'll notice nothing because it didn't play. Come on. Oh. This has seriously worked every other time. It's probably because of my, I don't know, Mac to. Anyway, they were really cool, and you should check them out. But essentially, what's happening with these weather patterns is you'll see these more stable systems where there's a little bit of a fluctuation in the waves, so you're not getting extreme precipitation. But as time goes on, what's happening is these waves are slowing down and they're becoming more intense, more extreme, and they kind of meander in place and they get stuck in certain regions in some instances as well. And what this does is it creates persistent weather patterns. So we might see more days that it's nice, more days when it's not nice. So essentially, weather is going to be expanded in terms of what we see on a week-to-day basis. And in this image, which would have been really awesome to show you, you could see also, how do I do this? You could see how some of these circulation patterns actually break off from that main jet stream and get trapped in a certain region. And this is where we're seeing those extreme drought conditions happening or extreme flooding happening as well. So the whole point of this, not that you didn't get to see that awesome animation, but precipitation variability is increasing as a result of the weakening jet stream. And this essentially just means a few things. One, we're expected to see larger precipitation events when they do occur and longer periods between precipitation events. It's also projected that there will be changes in rainfall patterns both monthly as well as seasonally. So why study plants and why they respond to precipitation patterns in the first place? So I just gave a few examples of ecosystems that have been severely impacted by extreme precipitation events. And if you imagine that these ecosystems continue to get these types of extreme patterns, that could have major consequences for ecosystem processes as well as the plant communities that are there. So I'll just point out the drought one. In 2012, there was an extreme drought that occurred, and that is actually what the soil looked like. It was so extreme that it killed all vegetation, and you could stick your hand into the ground. Unfortunately, I wasn't there that year. That would have been a cool year to be able to start my research. But so let's think. So the next part I want to do is kind of build up my thought process of how I think about my research. And to do that, I'm going to kind of build up an ecosystem. So if we imagine that this is soil, it's brown, and a global change driver that's occurring. In this case, I'm particularly interested in extreme precipitation patterns. And we think about this in terms of different ecological levels. So to begin with, it's harder without the thing. Anyway, within the soil, there's abiotic conditions that are occurring. So these abiotic conditions are essentially anything that's not living within the system, they're environmental conditions. So this is soil temperature, soil moisture, as well as nutrient availability within the soil. And soil temperature and moisture affect not only plants, but they also affect microbes. And the reason why, understanding why it affects microbes as well, is because microbes are involved in providing plants with the plant available nitrogen that they need to be able to grow and thrive. So if you can imagine these global change drivers that are affecting these abiotic conditions, it's also going to affect the microbes, which are able to organic nitrogen into plant available forms in terms of ammonium and nitrate. So now building up these levels, so now I'm adding on plants into my ecosystem. So at the individual level, when extreme precipitation event occurs, symbiotic interactions that are occurring. And then ultimately all the way up to the ecosystem level, where these things can alter the productivity within the community as well as nutrient cycling. So productivity is essentially affecting the carbon cycle, and nutrient cycling, in this case, I was primarily interested in the nitrogen cycle. It's a limiting resource where I did my field work. But if you imagine, plants are uptaking that nitrogen, but they're also inputting this into the soil. So the soil and the plants themselves are interacting in a way as well. And all of these things are intertwined and related and can affect what we see after we experience an extreme precipitation event. So earlier I mentioned resistance and resilience. So I want to use this figure to kind of explain that. So essentially this came from a paper where we did a theoretical kind of concept of what might be happening in terms of these responses, community responses to drought in particular. And if you imagine this is some type of relative community change, you could change it into whatever variable you would be interested in. And the community is going to be at this level 0. Whatever it normally is what that would be. So there's obviously going to be fluctuations from year to year, but it's generally going to be, let's say, a grassland, right? And then a meteorological drought occurs, so that means that the moisture, or there's no rainfall for a prolonged period of time. And then it's going to be some time before the plants actually physiologically respond to that drought, that the abiotic conditions become so stressful that the plants must do something to be able to either survive or not. And then there's going to be a response. And this response that I'm referring to is a community level response. But this graph also helps us understand resistance. So resistance of a system is, you can think about it in terms of two ways. You could think about it in terms of the time that it took from the meteorological drought to the response of the community as a whole, or you could think about it in terms of when the physiological responses started happening and then when plants actually started shifting. And resistance, in this case, the longer these lines would be, the more resistant the system is to change. And if we build upon this, so for this paper we did 2 different scenarios. So these are completely made up communities. This is not anything that's actually happened, but we were showing how what's actually happening to communities at different levels in drought. Do they respond immediately within the drought, or is much of the response after the drought actually occurred? And then this portion here is when we get to, I'm going to use quotes here because I know that this is a touchy word, but a stable community, right? So when we get to this stable community, that would be the measure of resilience of the system. So if I kind of give the extreme examples, a system would be completely resistant if it followed this line the entire time and didn't change at all. It was resistant to that change. If the system was completely resilient, what we would see is instead of being changed, it would have went back down to that original community structure in the first place. So just to give you an idea of what I mean by resistance and resilience. So when we study precipitation changes on plants, there are several different types of experiments that have been laid out in this paper, although one could argue that you could expand upon this. But in general, we can reduce precipitation and create droughts. So these can be long, short-term droughts, seasonal droughts, or we can have the amount remaining constant, which is actually probably more similar to what will happen with climate change, and redistribute that precipitation in different ways. So this can be a within season or extreme intense precipitation, so where you're maybe droughting the plots for a certain time, but then adding that water back in one major event. And it can also be across seasons or seasonally redistributed. And according to different climate assessments, this shows what we expect in terms of precipitation change if we do the business as usual scenario. So essentially, just emitting the same amount that we've already emitted in terms of CO2 and not really changing anything, not doing anything to mitigate climate change. And precipitation changes are going to be increased when it's darker green, and when it's darker orange, that means that there's a greater reduction in precipitation. And these different seasons there's projections of different reductions as well as additions. And in the summer, it's projected to be reduced throughout a large portion of the continent. And the real reason why I wanted to show you this was it's cool, but also to show you where my field site was. So I was in Indiana, so that's right about there in this map. Indiana, for some reason, got kind of like smudged out in the map. But Indiana, and that is my field site at Purdue Wildlife Area in West Lafayette, Indiana. It is part of the really flat portion of Indiana where a lot of agriculture takes place. Okay, so how do we manipulate precipitation in the field? And I have used a variety of techniques, particularly in this first experiment that I did, which I did a seasonal redistribution experiment, sort of, but I added precipitation manually with actually just watering the plots, and then used a rain-out shelter, which you'll see lots and lots of rain-out shelters today. So rain-out shelters are essentially just using plastic sheeting on top of these structures to divert the precipitation away from the plots, and essentially create a drought on the system. And then finally, in this experiment, I also manipulated winter precipitation, just snowfall, and I shoveled to do that. And then finally, the other two experiments that I did for my dissertation work were in a restored tall grass prairie. So this used to be an agricultural field before that. It was 2008, I think, restored. So it's a pretty stable ecosystem, and I'll get into that later. But first, I'm going to talk about the temperate deciduous forest experiment. So in this experiment, I manipulated both winter and summer precipitation over the period of 2 years. And the design essentially was that there was a dry, a control, and a wet treatment for both winter and summer precipitation. In the winter, I did a snow removal where I removed 100% from the plot and then added that onto the wet plots. In the summer, I did a minus 50% through fall reduction. Ambient through fall was the control, and then a plus 50% precipitation treatment. And this experiment was the nested design. So if we look at this image here, this is a block, right? So these are all the possible treatments in one block, and I did 3 of them. And if we look here, this is going to be, winter is nested within the summer. So this would be a rain-out shelter here. So if we imagine this rain-out shelter, under here are the 3 winter treatments, so dry, control, and ambient. So I had total possible combinations of 9, and replicated it 3 times, as I said. So I wanted to explore the effects on the abiotic environment, specifically soil temperature and moisture, because that affects plants, but it also affects microbes as well. There's been some research in winter ecology that has shown that mineralization can really be affected by winter precipitation in future seasons. So snow acts as an insulating barrier that helps regulate the temperature so that they're not fluctuating too much and you get less freeze-thaw events occurring. And then I also explored woody plant recruitment. I planted seeds of 4 different species of plants, both invasive and exotic and native. Unfortunately, with fieldwork, not everything works out as you plan, and only 1 species actually grew, but still got some interesting results from that. And then I also looked at understory composition. So this is kind of one of the things that with these types of experiments, forests are much more difficult to manipulate precipitation, and especially getting it above the canopy is an issue. What I found is that large changes in winter and summer precipitation had little effect on forest processes. The system was resistant to changes in mineralization as well as understory composition. And I looked at soil temperature and I looked at soil moisture, and both were affected by these treatments. But I did find that this one species that I did plant, that was the native species that grew, was impacted by winter and summer precipitation. But interestingly, I never found any interactive effects for any of the areas that I looked at. So the winter and summer precipitation were acting independently on the system. So here is the germination rate. So the germination rate was affected by the winter treatment. The dry treatment reduced germination. I suspect that's because of the variability that we saw in the soil temperatures, creating kind of a more not ideal scenario for those seeds. And then in terms of relative growth, the dry treatments were increased relative to control and wet. And I suspect that that's primarily because it was really wet both years. So another thing with field experiments is that you can't control what the weather is going to look like. So my control was actually very wet, and my wet was really wet. So I think what this shows is that wet precipitation in the summer could potentially reduce relative growth in this system. And I'm not sure that we really got a drought happening. So essentially, this system was resistant to change. So now I'm going to move on to my grassland experiment. So as I mentioned, forests are much less studied, and grasslands are studied a lot. So why do it in the first place? Well, first of all, the International Drought Experiment is an experiment that I'm collaborating with a bunch of other researchers with, and we're establishing the same experiment around the world. So there's even one here at Ploughe as well, and it's a 1 in 100 year reduction in precipitation over the course of 4 years. The rainout shelters never get removed from the plots. They stay up all the time. And the reason why I'm not going to share this is because I didn't find anything. This system was also resistant to change. So this kind of led me to the question of, after a year, I'm not really answering any questions. Everything's resistant to change, but what is causing these changes, and why are some communities so sensitive to drought, whereas others are not? So that's where this timing of extreme drought experiment came about. That was not in my original proposal for my dissertation and became a large portion of it. So what actually do we know about grasslands in terms of productivity as well as community composition? We know that productivity has been found to be related to annual precipitation, where the more precipitation you get, the higher productivity is, right? So what I wanted to show you, though, is that this study is another way that we can explore the impacts of precipitation changes on plant communities, and that's taking advantage of these extreme precipitation events that occur. So that 2012 drought that I showed you, they took advantage of that event and looked at how productivity changed based upon the previous year at these different levels of precipitation. And essentially what they found is that the filled-in shapes are the year before the drought occurred, what the productivity was, and then the open shapes are what happened during the 2012 drought. And you'll see that they found a very similar relationship in terms of productivity and median annual precipitation. But the thing is that it's not always that simple in science, right? So there's many other studies that also have shown that no changes occur in productivity, including the ones that I've been doing. There's no changes even after years and years of implementing extreme drought on a system. It doesn't affect the community. So when we talk about productivity, we also can think about the community itself, because the community is going to be what's providing us with the productivity. And we can look at the community in terms of its diversity, and diversity is related to productivity in a negative relationship. So the higher your productivity is, it tends to reduce diversity. So what is diversity? So diversity is an index that there's many indices that scientists use, and it's a way of getting to understand what this community actually looks like, and is it really diverse. If we just looked at species richness, for example, which is just the number of species, you would say the community 1 and community 2 are exactly the same, because they all include these 4 species. But it's not quite that simple, because if you look at the even evenness of these systems, it's quite different. So community 1 is completely even in terms of these 4 species, whereas community 2 is dominated by the species. And what that means is that we would consider community 1 to have greater diversity than community 2, even though they have the same number of species. Okay. So few studies have really explored the impacts of the length and timing of drought on grasslands. So the 2 studies that I was able to find that kind of matched somewhat similarly what I would like to do in terms of this timing of extreme drought experiment was that this experiment found that the timing of drought did affect when productivity was decreased. So they found that in these 2 time periods during the growing season that productivity was decreased. And the length of drought can also impact productivity as well. And how many people have manipulated the length of drought is by altering the number of rainfall events that occur. So essentially you keep the ambient conditions and then you cover these plots with rainout shelters and then you water them so that they only experience 4, 6, 12 precipitation events as opposed to larger precipitation events occurring over time. And this shows that when you don't have a precipitation event, when there's a greater time between these precipitation events, essentially you're creating a drought. So by reducing the number of precipitation events, you're creating more droughts, and that is reducing ANPP. So to get to my actual experiment, I wanted to know was how does the timing and duration of drought within a growing season affect community responses? And is there an interaction? Do they matter together? Does one matter more than the other? And to explain this, I'd like to look a little bit at my site. So here's my site, and it is pretty much dominated by Solidago canadensis. It is not a diverse site. It is dominated by Solidago canadensis with Andropogon gerardii as the second. It can be co-dominant with Solidago canadensis. And then there's legumes as well. So legumes have the ability to fix their own nitrogen. So remember how I said microbes normally provide the available nitrogen to the plants? Well, some plants can have a symbiotic relationship with fungi, and they can fix their own nitrogen as well. And then there's some shrubs and non-calydophores in there as well. And shrubs is a major issue in this system because it is a restored site, and we're trying to keep it a grassland, and woody plant encroachment can be a big issue when you're trying to keep it as a prairie. So what was the experimental design? So this is kind of my site here, and essentially each plot either had one of these infrastructure controls on it or the rainout shelters. The rainout shelters removed precipitation when they were in place, approximately 100%. And then we used infrastructure controls because one of the critiques of using rainout shelters is that they reduce photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. And by covering these with, it's actually construction fencing, the idea is that you're shading the plots a little bit, and you're also reducing PAR in those plots as well. And we were able to get PAR within 5% of the rainout shelters, so pretty similar to one another. In these types of field experiments, it's a lot harder to control for confounding variables, as we all know. So the experimental design, I had 8 different treatments, and this was replicated 4 times. And anytime you see a gray box, that means that there's an infrastructure control in place. A black box indicates when there's a rainout shelter in place. So this was a lot of shuffling around after 7 weeks. The people that were helping me were glad to be done after moving all these rainout shelters all the time. But there was essentially an ambient plot that always had an infrastructure control in place. And then there was 3 7-week droughts, either early, middle, or late. And then 3 14-week droughts, early to middle, middle to late. One that began early in the growing season, and then there was a reprieve, and one that started up again at the end of the growing season. And then just for fun, a 21-week drought that I thought would kill everything. But anyway, so to try and control for more factors, I also wanted to control for the vegetation that was on the plots, as well as to try to control some of the woody plant encroachment that I saw for my other field experiment, which is basically covered with raspberries, and it's so hard to get in there without getting damaged and cut up. So I burned the plots, and essentially to remove all that vegetation, remove any litter that was on there, so that everybody kind of started out on an even keel in terms of the inputs that the plants were inputting into the soil. I also trenched around the plots. So trenching is essentially digging a hole, lining that hole with plastic, and then filling it back in. And what this does is that by putting the plastic within the plots, it doesn't allow for the flow of water in or out of the plots. So it's helping control a little bit more and trying to get these droughts to be a little bit more extreme and affect the system more similarly to an actual drought. And we got it down to 75 centimeters, so that's pretty deep for trenching. I also looked at soil moisture, and I did it at a variety of depths, and I'm not going to show you the soil moisture results, but it was indeed, did create very extreme low soil moisture in each of these plots, and at multiple depths, all the way down to the 100 centimeter mark as well. And I did several different methods for exploring the plant community, but today I'm just going to talk about the biomass harvest data. So from biomass harvest data, I can get at productivity, so ANPP. I can also get at composition. So by sorting it into species as well as dead material, I can start to answer some of those questions about community composition, as well as whether the drought plots were senescing earlier than the other plots. So my predictions were that the drought would reduce ANPP, so lower soil moisture would result in a reduction in productivity. I also thought that both timing and length would impact the system, where droughts that occurred in the middle of the growing season when plants are growing the most would have the greatest impact on productivity, and then the late season droughts were almost when the plants were done growing, so I didn't expect a lot of productivity changes in those plots. And then in terms of length, I obviously thought that the 21-week drought would be much more reduced than the 14 and the 7-week. And I thought that there would be an interaction between these two, the timing and as well as the length of drought. So I'm also going to talk about diversity, as you can probably imagine, but I thought that drought would alter diversity depending on productivity as well, and the timing and length of drought. So, as I showed you earlier, productivity has been found to be negatively related to, or diversity has been found to be negatively related to productivity. So I thought that the more productivity was reduced, there would be a negative effect on diversity. I thought that in terms of timing, I actually thought the earlier droughts would have a positive effect on diversity. And my thought process here was that by stunting the growth early in the growing season, so if you remember back to what my field site looked like, these are really tall species that grow very fast. And that's, if it stunted the growth of these species, it could potentially leave space and opening for other species to be able to fill in once that drought is relieved. And then I thought that longer droughts would have a positive effect because, again, reducing productivity could actually have a positive effect on diversity. And then the 21-week drought, I thought maybe a couple plants would survive, but it wouldn't be very diverse whatsoever. So what did I find? Oh, sorry, I always forget that part. So I thought, again, these things would be cumulative. So what did I find? I found that above ground productivity was positively related to average soil moisture before the harvest, and a fairly high R-square value for ecological data. But what I also found was that the timing of the drought was more important for productivity responses than the length of the drought. So in these next images, I've kind of kept these color schemes the same. but I did a little bit different of analysis. I'm not going to get into the analysis, but I'll show you my bar graphs, and each individual dot on there is my actual observation that I took. And what I found was that early season droughts treatments reduced productivity, and it didn't matter what the length was. It didn't matter if it was 14 weeks or 21 week droughts. So basically, this is just combining these different treatments according to what type of drought they experienced. So either droughts that are treatments that did not have an earlier middle drought. So in this case, it was ambient and late, and then this early middle drought would be the black, early middle late, and the early middle, because both of those contained early and middle droughts. And then finally, I also found that mid-season drought treatments were reduced relative to late season droughts. So they didn't change compared to the control. It's the same kind of idea, but instead of grouping it by early or middle droughts, it's grouped by middle and late droughts. And again, it didn't matter whether it was, in this case, a 7 or 14-week drought or that 21-week drought either. So it was more about the timing of the drought for productivity than the actual length. So how is diversity altered? Well, first of all, I want to point out that I did not find a relationship between productivity and diversity at my site. What I did find was that in the first year, diversity, oops, I messed that up, but diversity was reduced in late season droughts. So that's right here. This is 2016. That's that first year. It was reduced in late season droughts, which is what I had anticipated because I kind of thought that those plant communities would already be established and wouldn't really be changing diversity in that first year. What I didn't expect was that there was no significant changes in the second year. And I also found in the first year that early season droughts did increase diversity. And again, this is grouping them all just based upon whether they had an early season drought or they did not have an early season drought. And so regardless of whether it was 7, 14, 21-week droughts, the diversity was increased in those plots. And if you look at the actual data points, I mean, they kind of do cluster very well together. You wouldn't be able to tell had I not had them color-coded which one was which, right? And then, yeah, I guess I jumped ahead. So in the second year, the only thing that I did find was that late season droughts actually increased diversity, which is not what I expected, but we suspect that there's maybe some stress tolerant mechanisms that were occurring that since they had experienced the drought beforehand, that the next year they were better able to handle the drought and diversity was increased. So essentially what I found from my PhD research was that music terrestrial ecosystems in the Midwestern U.S. were generally resistant to changes in precipitation, but timing and not the length of drought can alter these processes in the system. So this is, okay, sorry, it's hard to do this. So after I looked at this, I was wondering, what are some of the mechanisms that are causing this resistance and resilience in these different ecosystems? Why are people seeing that grasslands are responding tremendously fast, whereas others are not? And so through the International Drought Experiment and DroughtNet, through a distributed graduate seminar that I participated in, I came up with this idea and then worked with other colleagues in that network to develop a theoretical framework for potentially why we see this resistance and resilience in plant communities and connect it to some of the mechanisms that might be involved. So I'm not going to talk about it, but I'll just show you a little bit about it. So it's a theoretical framework. Like so I showed you the graph before. That was just one of the graphs that we proposed. And it's the mechanisms behind resistance and resilience. And what I did is I built a little word cloud just to give you an idea of what that paper is about. So it's mainly about drought and plant communities, but it's also about the interactions that occur within these plant communities. And so if you're interested, you can check out that paper further to see what we kind of hypothesized could be happening in these ecosystems and how plant-to-plant interactions might actually be contributing to what we see in terms of community responses. So finally, I'm I'm going to bring myself back to these global change drivers. So when I think about myself doing research in the future, I'd like to continue to incorporate these global change drivers in different aspects, primarily focusing on climate change, but adding different variables as well, like land use change or novel assemblages into the mix and disturbance regimes. And again, I like to think about my research as looking at this as a whole collective thing, because it's not just the community that's changing, it's also the populations and the individuals that are changing. And these are all affecting ecosystems. And then my ultimate goal for research would then be to look at what's happening at different levels within the ecosystem. So hopefully here at TRU, I can do this second part with the microbes. So exploring what's happening with the microbes with drought and whether they're being impacted. And also pollinators. So there was a study that was done that I am interested in exploring further that showed that the nutritional quality of pollen of Solideo canadensis or Canada goldenrod is actually decreasing over time. So potentially using museum records to see if this is really an issue and could be maybe a cause for concern when we're dealing with pollinators. And then ultimately I would like to branch it up to these global processes, probably collaborating with other researchers that are more into this, but using my research to inform these global models so we can get a better understanding of what's going to happen with climate change and how ecosystems are going to respond to them. So then I kind of broke it down into two major questions of what I'd like my research to, where I'd like my research to go. I would like to further explore mechanisms to determine the resistance of or resilience of community. What mechanisms determine the resistance or resilience of community or ecosystem function, and then use that information as well as other ecological theory to inform how we might improve management and restoration processes. So currently, at least in the U.S. where I was, I did call management property managers, and a lot of them are really not concerned about climate change. And if we aren't concerning ourselves with that, it might be an issue in terms of what we might see our ecosystems turning into. For example, at that site, it's really getting dominated by that Solideo canadensis, and it's just continuing to do so. Why is that happening? And how can we fix that? And how can we use ecological theory? How can we use things like community assembly and biotic interactions to help us better understand how we can rebuild these ecosystems that might have been damaged? So to answer these questions, again, my themes are to look at ecosystem function, carbon and nitrogen cycles, biodiversity. This is plant biodiversity, and hopefully expanding upon that into microbial biodiversity. Plant community assembly, how are plants assembling, why are they assembling, what are the biotic interactions that are involved in that? And by biotic interactions, I mean plant-to-plant interaction, plant-to-soil interactions, what's causing these differences in community assemblies that we're seeing. And then finally, this is kind of a lower priority, but acclimation and adaptation of the plants within these systems. So acclimation is simply that the plants are not changing their genetics, they're just changing their phenotype to respond to the drought, and they're able, or to drought, or whatever extreme precipitation you're talking about. Whereas adaptation is actual genetic adaptation to it. So I would like to explore that as well. And I'd like to use a number of experimental approaches. So far I've pretty much used field experiments and laboratory techniques, so using extraction to get nitrogen mineralization, looking at C to N ratios, things like that. But I'd also like to expand using greenhouse experiments and mesocosms, as well as genetic and molecular tools to try to get an idea of more about what's happening at the individual and population level to hopefully inform what's happening at the community level. And so the study systems that I'm interested in exploring at the individual and population level would be exotic species. So here I have an image of a major exotic species in Indiana, which is garlic mustard. And then Solidago canadensis is the dominant species. What's making these species so dominant and taking over? This species wasn't even planted when they did the restoration, and it has completely dominated the system. And then as well as endangered species. So this is a picture of milkweed, which when we alter community dynamics, and if a species is lost, such as this, it can also affect other trophic levels. And in this case, the milkweed is very important because it's affecting monarch butterflies, and because they use this plant to breed. So if this plant's no longer there, we could see an extinction of that plant due to the extinction of monarch butterflies due to the extinction of the plants themselves. So really looking at rare species has been kind of something that's been in my mind for a little bit, because a lot of people study invasives, but what is causing these other plants to not be so successful as well will help me hopefully answer these questions. And then finally, I'd like to continue to focus on terrestrial ecosystems. So these would be natural systems, which my forest experiment was pretty much natural. That was probably the only portion of that property that hadn't been affected for at least the past 70 years. And then degraded systems or old agricultural fields, urban systems, potentially agricultural fields, and then other degraded systems like we have here at TRU, where it's just filled with exotics, and it's not really being beneficial in any way to the environment or to humans as well, because ecosystems it's not just about the ecology of it. Ecosystems also provide important services for people as well. So that's important to consider. So with that, I will open it up to questions.